Ambassador Rosenblum, it's wonderful to be speaking to you at the embassy in Tashkent. We've always had conversations in Washington, now that I think about it. And it's super special, actually, to be sitting like this next to you after 2 years of the pandemic, you know, with so much virtual communication. It feels weird, actually.
It does, it does. It feels weird to be sitting in the same room as people when you're talking to them and to see their full faces and not through a mask. So,
and the embassy seems to be back full scale at work.
It is, yeah. Our embassy
no more telework for you.
No more telework, and although I have to say that the telework habits we developed during the pandemic will be useful, and it allows us to do more things and be more flexible. But we're all back at work. We're not even any longer wearing masks in the embassy. And that's obviously a reflection of the improvement in the COVID situation. But, you know, we're a little cautious because we've seen in some other countries in the world, COVID's come back in new forms. And so we remain vigilant. But it's a great change, and it allows us to do things like this.
We saw a long line of visa applicants outside, excited, impatient, nervous, waiting for their appointments, and we see a crowded embassy. So in a way, back to normalcy.
Yeah, we're basically back to normal operations in our consular section as well. We're trying to make up for lost time. There's a big backlog of people who are interested in both immigrant and non-immigrant visas, and our consular section is working through that and trying to reduce the backlog. I do know that some people, because I hear this when I just meet people out in the city or around the country, are frustrated because it's not so easy to get an interview sometimes. You know, you just have to schedule an interview for the visa, and there's so much interest and so much, you know, people are immediately filling up the slots. But we're going to work on that. We're going to try to meet all the needs, and frankly, it's gratifying to know that there's so much interest in the United States in visiting our country, and it shows that I think the depth of the ties between our two nations.
Yeah, I mean, every Uzbek has an American dream. That's what we say. I just interviewed Counselor Chief Rob Romanowski. It was a great interview, and there we discussed how you don't have a role in that process, how U.S. ambassador in any country doesn't and should not interfere into the consular services process.
Right.
But I'm sure you must get asked a lot by ordinary Uzbeks and by others, including, I'm suspecting here, officials about visa processes.
Yes.
What is your answer usually? How do you get away from that situation?
You're absolutely right. I do get asked a lot, even on random occasions. I remember once I was on a flight flying back from Germany. I had gone to Germany for a holiday, just a weekend, and I was on an Uzbekistan Airways flight from Frankfurt to Tashkent, and the person sitting next to me recognized me and immediately began asking about a visa. So what I said then and what I say to people is the first thing is, as ambassador, there's actually a wall that's put up legally that I'm not part of that process, that I'm not supposed to be part of the decision-making process or even to influence it. So that's the first thing I say. They usually don't believe me when I tell them that, but I tell them that's the truth.
They look at you with a suspicion, like,
he's hiding something or whatever. Occasionally, what I can do is at least give them information about who they should call or what they should do, or explain the context. You know, for example, during the pandemic, when we were so limited, I was able to explain to people why we were so limited. We were still issuing some visas, but on a very limited basis. And so that's what I can do, but I'm not going to be able to solve their visa problem. I refer them to Rob and his team.
Yeah, very often at the Voice of America we get messages from our viewers and fans who say, hey, can you please talk to American ambassador? Like, you know, let him open the process, especially during the pandemic, you know, when the services were not fully provided and things were restricted and all of that. And we do our best to guide them. It's a constant conversation.
It is. And you know, it's important, I think, for people to understand why it is the way it is. What I was saying about this wall that's set up between the ambassador and my role and the consular section and the consular chief, the idea is that there are rules governing how we issue visas and the criteria that are required for people to gain entry to the United States. And the people who know those rules and who are technically competent should be making the decision. It should not be influenced by political considerations or personal preference. I like this person, so you should give them a visa. And in order to avoid that, we've set up this system of separation.
A good example to show how corruption could be avoided, can be or should be avoided, right?
Yes, exactly.
A lot changed throughout the pandemic, as you know, and a lot changed since last year, since our conversation. Afghanistan was a priority at that time. We talked about what would be the future of Afghanistan, what Uzbeks wanted in this process, and how you were working very closely with the Uzbek government to make sure that all the political parties in Afghanistan would find a common ground and take Afghanistan to a new stage. And now we have the Taliban in power in Kabul, and I've had several conversations with the Uzbek officials about this. Before we get into, more deeper into this, what would the visits about, recent visits in Washington? We had Uzbek Foreign Minister Abdulaziz Kamilov visit Washington early March, and then a few days later, Investments and Foreign Trade Minister Sardar Umurzaqov was also there. What was the mission?
Well, first of all, both officials, the foreign minister and the deputy prime minister, hadn't been in the United States for a while. Both of them thought it was important to renew dialogue and to kind of show the face of Uzbekistan in the United States. And I think that's very important to do on a regular basis. I think the foreign minister had last been in June of last year, so it had been...
That's when he met the Biden administration.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a reason just to keep the dialogue going and do it in person when possible. And it's, again, because of the pandemic improving, it was easier. I think there's no question, and I think everyone who's watching this will agree that the geopolitical and economic situation in the world and in the region has gotten very complex in the last 6 months, and that is a reason why we need to have an intensified dialogue about our bilateral relationship, ways that we can help Uzbekistan to deal with the complications of the geopolitics and of the economic stresses, and ways that we can cooperate and collaborate towards the goal of a more stable region and a more prosperous region. So in both the case of the foreign minister, the deputy prime minister, they had specific issues they wanted to discuss that concerned those complications, whether it was the war that's happening in Ukraine, the situation in Afghanistan, dealing with the government that's there now, the Taliban-run government, how to keep momentum going for regional cooperation between Central Asia and South Asia and within Central Asia. That whole range of issues they were bringing to the table, and we had a lot of chance for a good, frank discussion about them.
And trade and economics as well, right?
Yeah. As part of bringing stability and prosperity to the region, how can we increase our bilateral trade? How can we can get more interest from American companies to invest here in Uzbekistan and create jobs? That was, again, all part of the dialogue. Obviously the focus was slightly different between the two visits. The deputy prime minister's visit was very focused on economic relations and the trade and investment and so on, including, by the way, Uzbekistan's bid to join the WTO. That featured heavily. Whereas the foreign minister's visit was more focused on the sort of relations within the region, the challenges we face with both respect to Ukraine and Afghanistan and the like. But they were productive visits, I would say. There was a lot of good information was passed and a lot was achieved.
The Uzbek government has been quite discreet, though, about these visits. They haven't really publicized. This was intentional, as far as I know, that they wanted to keep it more like behind the scenes. And because these are sensitive times, as you know, and this is all happening as we were still trying to find out what would Tashkent's position be regarding the war in Ukraine and regarding the Russian, aggression, Russian war on Ukraine. And things have cleared a little bit with Foreign Minister Kamilov explaining policy in the Uzbek Senate recently. Do you, as Uzbekistan's strategic partner, understand Uzbekistan's position? How clear is it for you? Where does Tashkent stand on this?
I think we do understand it and appreciate it and respect the constraints and the kind of tough choices that Uzbekistan faces. And again, the two visits that we discussed, we had lots of opportunity to really understand Uzbekistan's position, and I think that was, part of the purpose of these visits was to explain that. We deeply respect the fact that due to geography and history, Uzbekistan has to balance a lot of interests and has to get along with its neighbors, especially its neighbors who are also trading partners and important sources of investment. In some cases, in the case of, for example, Russia, a lot of labor migration and labor migrants who are then sending money home, which is an investment in the economy here. Those things are fundamental to Uzbekistan's survival as a country, and we do understand that entirely. The situation in Ukraine, this is not the time to go into a long discussion about it because people are reading about it in the newspaper every day or seeing it on the news. There's not much I can add, but it really points out the importance of some of the fundamental principles that we always stress in our relationship with Uzbekistan. And, sovereignty and independence, that we always start out pretty much every bilateral meeting by saying we support and respect each other's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. These are international principles that are vital to having a stable world. Because once those principles go out the window, it's all about who has power and who can impose their will on somebody else. And sadly, that's what we're seeing with the Russian invasion in Ukraine. But I think it has relevance for Uzbekistan because those principles are dear to Uzbekistan, and we've seen this throughout its 30-year history of independence. So it's important to have these frank discussions that we're having, to understand each other's perspectives. And I also thought, you mentioned the foreign minister's statement last week laying out Uzbekistan's position. I thought it was a very reasonable, clear, and understandable position. So anyway, to your question about us understanding and kind of appreciating Uzbekistan's position, absolutely, and we stand ready to work with Uzbekistan to deal with the challenges that this war has brought to the world and to the region.
Any hard feelings? Because you still expect things from your strategic partners, right? You want them to be with you on these are historic times. Like as what we heard in Washington again and again was that this is the time for each country to choose a side. Mm-hmm. Like you need to know with who you are at this point. So Central Asians abstaining mainly and choosing to be neutral in general. Mm-hmm. And also a major factor here is that the public, pretty much not just in Uzbekistan, in the neighboring countries. Well, we don't know what's happening in Turkmenistan for sure, but the public seems to be more critical of the war than the governments. Mm. And in your decisions, in your let's say choices and analysis, you take that into account, right? I mean, it's not just what you hear from the government, but from the people of these countries. Mm-hmm. So, how are you reading the public mood?
I'm not going to pretend to know the answer to that precisely. We don't have surveys or anything that we're doing about public mood, and I'm not sure that there are any public opinion surveys happening here that we could look to to understand that. So what do we have to go on? Well, there's just talking to people in your daily life. Talking to the people you meet in the store or that you see on the street, or visa applicants, I suppose. Right. Although they might have a very particular perspective that's different than the
That'd
general
be a long
population.
Conversation.
Yeah, but so you can do that. You can look at what people are posting on social media, what's being printed in the press, or what experts who are looking at public opinion tell you. And if I take all of that into account, it's clear to me that here in Uzbekistan, opinions are split. that there's a split. I don't know what the split is. I can't say it's 50-50, 80-20, whatever. It's hard to say. It's definitely split. And that's something that we look at, but I have to say, going back to the start of your question about, appreciating the position that Uzbekistan is taking and whether there are hard feelings, I think is the word you used. In terms of the bilateral relationship, no, there are not hard feelings, because again, we understand completely the dilemma, you might say, that Uzbekistan faces, and we appreciate that. So I think the key here is Uzbekistan has staked a position, and if you look at the foreign minister's statement, this is clear, of essentially neutrality, saying we have deep historical and important relationships with Russia and with Ukraine, and we're not going to choose a side, essentially. So I think it's important that the one thing we would expect as this, because of the stakes and the important principles involved in this war, is that neutrality be real neutrality. That is, if you're not going to...
Genuine neutrality.
Yeah, genuine neutrality. You're not going to... Yes, of course, we understand you're not going to be out there, criticizing the invasion or, providing the kind of aid that many countries in Europe are providing to Ukraine, military aid and things of that nature. But you're also not going to be doing the same on the other side. You're not going to be cheering on or aiding and abetting the other side. So I think that's something that America would look at and look for, is the neutrality a genuine neutrality? But if it is, it's, again, understandable, and it doesn't change our basic belief that Uzbekistan is a strategic partner, that there is much that unites us, and we have many common interests, and that we want to continue building that relationship.
The most coherent answer I heard from the Uzbek officials so far is that, we have to be super careful, that, Russia is scary. They don't hide that we are afraid of Russia. We cannot anger them. Like, we don't need that extra problem. And especially when we see what's happening to Ukraine, what will it become of a country if, you get on the nerves of the Kremlin and, President Vladimir Putin. And also, there is this cautiousness, and if they don't hide this, and maybe perhaps they've already told you, that nobody will protect us if we get into trouble. Like, if something like that happens to us, we have to really take care of ourselves. So this is like a preemptive, sort of like a step, we don't need that headache. So there are many people, in my observation, in the Uzbek government who obviously don't like what Russia is doing. In many ways, I also sense a certain level of anger and disappointment, because they don't want to be in this situation, as you just said. But at the same time, they cannot ignore the public view, right? They cannot ignore the public opinion. And now more than ever, they know the public opinion. As much as they try to control it, now I'm sure you've noticed that the Uzbek state media, in general, the Uzbek media, are not really covering Ukraine. And they've been asked not to do that informally. And several bloggers and journalists have been warned, they've been interrogated, they've been pressured to stop their coverage of Ukraine. And initially, I believe they were asked not to analyze the war, and then later on they said nothing, like nothing on Ukraine. And from what I've found out so far is that this is a temporary measure. This is for the good of the country. This is for the good of the Uzbek society. This is for the peace of the country. And to some extent, the public seems to understand that. Because you can't stop Uzbeks from criticizing the system now, at least on social media, right? They get it out somehow. So many active bloggers have now been taking the side of the Uzbek government, basically saying that we get it, we have to be careful. We have to fight this information war that Russia is raging against all of us. You understand Uzbek, you try to speak Uzbek, I know you follow Russian. Do you still believe that Uzbekistan is under a great Russian information influence?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think there's a lot of Russian media penetration here. There's no question about it. I do know that here, and maybe somewhat in contrast with some of the other Central Asian countries, there's a heavy reliance on Uzbek language sources of information and media, which is a good thing. And of course, it's good for pride in your own language and your own nation, but also, it avoids a little bit of that, overwhelming Russian media influence, which is an influence that leads, in my view, and I think the view of a lot of the rest of the world today, to a completely false and distorted picture of what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in the rest of the world. So that's a good thing. It's hard sometimes. You were asking earlier about what I thought public opinion was here on the war and so on. It's hard sometimes. One of the reasons it's hard to know that is that the volume, the loudness of the voices we're hearing from the Russian media drowns out other voices. It's so loud and so vehement, so aggressive, that it makes it seem like that's what everyone is thinking and everyone is saying because they're saying it loudly. Just to take one example that we experienced ourselves, our embassy in the early stages of the war was trying to provide additional information to add to the information space here by linking on our Facebook and other accounts, social media accounts, to stories about the real war that was happening in Ukraine. Really trying to show the human side, the human suffering of families, being split up, and of civilian deaths, of homes being destroyed, of maternity hospitals being bombed. All of those things. And what we found was that every time we posted one of those, we would get a torrent, a flood of vicious attacks that were anti-American,
Trolls.
anti-embassy. Probably trolls. It's hard to know, but one can speculate. It was mostly trolls. But the problem is that, you don't like to say the trolls won, but the fact is that when there's this flood of stuff, it does present a picture that makes it look like that represents public opinion, and that's what the people of Uzbekistan think. I don't believe that's true, but it does kind of come across that way. So anyway, I do think it's going back to what you were saying earlier about pressure on journalists not to report and so on. Again, I understand that that reaction, that the reaction of the government and even the reaction of journalists being understanding.
We must be careful. We must be careful.
Have to be careful. We don't want to provoke our neighbors too much. Again, understand and respect that. I do think it's really important, though, that approach not turn into an information blockade or a distorted view, because I'm not aware that there's any effort being made to block the falsehoods that are coming out of the Russian media.
Yeah, so the Uzbek media are not reporting about
Yeah.
Ukraine. People are learning about what's happening in Ukraine or what's happening with Russia.
From outside sources.
Through Russian media.
So that's also not neutral, and it's not balanced, right? So if you're going to be balanced and neutral, it has to be on both sides. Anyway, that said, it now appears this is going to be a long conflict, sadly, and a lot more suffering as a result. And so we're going to see how this story develops going forward, and we'll have a long time to see it develop. What I think is important, again, is to have certain principles be understood and accepted. One of those principles is, sovereignty and independence are important principles of international law and have to be respected, and you can't make exceptions to that. Secondly, that free information, the flow of information is really important. It helps to give a fully rounded picture of what's happening, so the media should be allowed to do its job. And I think the other thing is people accepting and understanding that there is such a thing as truth and as facts. I think too often we get so buffeted by all these sources of information, completely opposite of one another, that ordinary people, any consumer of that information starts to think that there can't be any truth, there can't be any facts, because how could these two, you can't reconcile them with each other, these two views of the world. But in fact, I think we have to stand up against that kind of thinking and say, yes, there are facts. It's sometimes hard to verify them. You sometimes have to work at it. But at the end, there is truth and there are facts. And I deeply believe that the facts of what is happening in Ukraine are coming out to the world, and it's revealing a tragedy, a human tragedy.
Factual reporting, accurate news are more critical than ever. We saw that during the pandemic. We see it now. This was true during the war in Afghanistan as well. One reason that I heard from the Uzbek officials so far, justification why they're controlling the coverage here in this country, is that they believe that the Uzbek media, the Uzbek language media, are not really capable of providing that kind of reliable reporting, that they're not skilled enough to cover wars, they are not skilled enough to cover conflict, to provide an objective, fair coverage of these issues. And of course, as a journalist, I always argue, like, yeah, they need to exercise, they need to train, they need to practice. Mm-hmm. This is what happens. I mean, you can't stop them because you believe that they're incapable. And what we have seen so far for the last 5 years in Uzbekistan is that Uzbek journalists can be very capable. They can be very effective in what they do if provided with enough space to work, to be creative enough. And I know that the U.S. government cares about media freedom in this country. You care about professional journalism in this country. You have been investing in that. What would be your recommendation going forward? How to get out of this situation? Because obviously Uzbekistan stands to benefit from reliable reporting, because they also want to fight what they call information wars. For example, like the recent remarks from Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko, directly addressing Uzbekistan. Hey, this is coming to you as well, was his message when things were getting violent in Kazakhstan early this year. And now we have this war. So this year so far has been pretty problematic in terms of
absolutely
mitigating, crisis. So what would you say to those, I guess, in the Uzbek government who are kind of brainstorming? Because they know they can't keep this tight for as long as they want. Things are going to get scandalous if they continue to do this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I always hesitate a little before giving advice to the government, because it's not my role unless they ask me. They haven't asked me. I do think, though, that it's really important, as I said before, to have sort of basic principles with respect to freedom of expression, independence of media. And President Mirziyoyev has multiple times over the years I've been here repeated how important it is to have an active, professional, and aggressive
vocal
media.
And critical, he says.
Vocal and critical, to point out the shortcomings and to be kind of a watchdog over, and to find corruption, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things. He said that. I think he believes it. I know he believes it. But it has to happen in practice too, right? And these are challenging times. Again, I'm not going to say, the government of Uzbekistan should do X with this Ukraine situation, because it's not my place to do that. But I think it's important to keep in mind that, if you're going to have a principle that professional, truthful, aggressive reporting is important to the health of a society, then that should apply all the time. It shouldn't just be, when it's convenient.
I'm asking this question mainly because you stand to benefit. You are interested in Uzbek people's knowledge, perceptions, understanding, fair understanding of what's really happening in the world. You definitely don't want anti-Americanism growing in this part of the world, right? I mean, Central Asia is not known for being anti-American in general, but right now, this seems to be very critical, because Uzbeks are watching and already have started to suffer from the impact of the American sanctions or Western sanctions on Russia. That's the main conversation here nowadays, Yeah. Why are we paying for the bread that we have not eaten? Is what they say, in Uzbek. That's a very, popular sort of saying that like, we haven't done anything, but why are we going to suffer from this? What's going to happen to those millions of migrant workers? I had a conversation earlier today with an entrepreneur who does business with both the United States, apparently, and Russia, and he's in the food industry. So he says, we're not seeing the impact yet, but he suspects that towards the summer it's going to be very evident that we would, we'll see large numbers returning, and the remittances going down and prices going up here. Do you worry about that? I mean, first, do you worry that it's going to hurt American image, America's credibility here, and also in general, what help or assistance can you provide? This is, after all, the largest society in Central Asia.
Right. Yeah. So this is a challenge that we're very aware of, and a potential risk. And I think the first thing we always have to do, because again, it's the reality, is to explain that the sanctions were the result of illegal, internationally unlawful actions taken by the Russian Federation by invading a sovereign country. The alternative to sanctions, I suppose, if you're going to try to reverse that action or make it, turn it around, would have been direct military involvement, which President Biden made very clear from the beginning was not going to happen. We were not going to take the risk of sending our own troops or putting our own personnel and equipment into Ukraine. That was, a recipe for World War III, I think is the term he used, or some words to that effect. So economic sanctions is a tool that we and the Europeans and many other countries who have joined them around the world, and it's a tremendous coalition, I would say, of countries doing this in unison, is a lever, it's a tool. And we recognize, the United States government recognizes that there are spillover effects. There's collateral damage, whatever you want to call it, that results from that. So I think you start by being honest and saying we understand that this is going to hurt other countries, but it had to be done for the good of international community. Then the second part, as you said, is what can we do to mitigate the effects, to make it less harmful and to help. In that respect, we had some discussions about that during these visits, these recent visits in Washington. And those discussions continue here in Tashkent, not only with the government of Uzbekistan, but with the rest of the international community. And I know there's a lot of focus here right now with the international financial institutions, the World Bank, the EBRD, the Asian Development Bank, and others, what they can do in the short term, including in the short term, to provide some financial help, some support to the economy and to the budget, the government budget, that will be stressed by the sanctions. At the same time, the United States, through USAID and many other countries, are trying to figure out ways that we can help with the economic impact, especially with regard to what you mentioned of migrant workers who will be returning from Russia. And it could be very large numbers. I mean, I think there's already a flow coming back, but anywhere between maybe 1 or 2 million might be returning, and that's a major stress for the economy. So what can we do to help create more jobs, to provide training, to provide information to returning migrants about what their options are? We're looking at all of that, and we'll be closely coordinating with the government to come up with ways to help.
And these efforts started because of the war?
Yes.
Because of the war?
Yeah, they did. I mean, I should add that, of course, a lot of these types of programs were already happening.
USAID mission and others.
Yeah, economic growth type programs. But yes, because of the war and in the aftermath of the start of the sanctions, the imposition of the sanctions, these discussions started, and we're now trying to figure out what can be done. I mean, I want to be, upfront and honest, and to say that there will be negative consequences. People will be suffering, and not just here in Uzbekistan, in the United States too. I mean, we're being impacted already in the U.S. It's being felt in much higher prices for gas. That's always sometimes a touchy political issue in the United States, the price of gas, because we have, the automobile is so important to our culture and our economy. But the price of gas has gone up by a huge percentage since the war started. And that's just one example. There's lots and lots of others. So yes, there will be pain, there will be negative consequences, but we need to work together to find ways to get through it and make life better for people.
One way I hear from Uzbek entrepreneurs who want investment from the United States, they want larger flow of investment from the United States, is that this could be a good time for the American companies to really seriously consider coming in and trying to fill the void a little bit. I mean, they do believe realistically that they can't yet fill all the space that, for example, Russians have been doing. You know, Russia is the biggest business partner for this country, not the largest investor, but the biggest business partner.
Right.
So
and the biggest trade partner for
yeah,
now,
exactly.
too.
Yeah. So do you think that this is going to trigger that kind of a change, that more American companies could be considering to come in?
I hope so, and I think it will. I mean, I can't, you know, it's hard today to predict what that will look like in terms of numbers of companies,
And especially
or
in terms of training, right? I mean, investing in human capital.
But yeah, I do think there's a great opportunity for American companies. This is something that we're always trying to present to them through our embassy. You know, we have people in our embassy who do nothing but promote U.S. trade and U.S. investment here in Uzbekistan. So I think the potential is there. And I truly believe that, and I've said this throughout my 3 years here, that American companies often bring something to the table that companies from other parts of the world don't. And that is that they really invest in people. They train their people. They're not going to bring large numbers of American staff from their headquarters here to work. They're going to hire locally, train people, and turn over a lot of responsibility to the local employees. And we've seen this over and over again.
What companies have done that so far?
So I mean, I'll give you two examples that I've seen in my time here. One is Honeywell, the Honeywell Corporation, which has actually been operating in Uzbekistan for over 20 years. They do a lot of work involved with the oil and gas and the chemical industries, providing the control systems, the electronic control systems. The technology to help it run properly. But I've visited some of their facilities here, and they, you know, it's all Uzbek employees. They're getting tremendous training opportunities to raise their skill level. And in one case, Honeywell set up essentially a call center, a support center, a technical support center here in Tashkent that is providing advice to oil and gas operations out, like in the Persian Gulf even, you know, like around the world, with Uzbek engineers providing the advice, all because of the training and experience they got from Honeywell. So that's one example. Another one is there's a much smaller American company called Silverleaf International, which is running one of the cotton clusters in Jizakh region. And I visited their farm, I've met their employees. They are providing some real chance for local people to learn how to work with mechanized farming. This is sort of the future of the cotton industry here, is to have, instead of it being all the cotton being hand-picked, to actually use machines to pick and harvest. And they have, and these machines are complicated. They're not easy to use. And in fact, one of the things I've noticed about Silverleaf is that they've emphasized hiring women to do these jobs and giving them the training for it, which is not an opportunity that women often get in the economy here. So there are multiple other examples, but I see again and again how U.S. companies are bringing that to the local economy. So the challenge now is, how can we replicate that? How can we get
and
more
increase and
companies
expand?
And increase and
yeah,
expand.
because, you know, I mean, you probably hear this a lot. You're always compared to what China is doing in the region, right? I mean, but you can't compete with China, though. But you can't compete with others. I mean, we see Turkey being more assertive now, so, you know, it's getting more active, not just in Uzbekistan, in the neighboring countries, too. So the geopolitical picture, as you just said earlier, is changing. And especially with what's happening in Afghanistan, or what's not happening in Afghanistan. The Biden administration has been calling for the creation of an inclusive government there since August. That's not happening. It hasn't happened yet. And Uzbeks realize that. But Uzbekistan seems to be the Taliban's closest friend now. Does that bother you? Because the Biden administration hasn't really announced its strategy on how to deal with the Taliban. The Washington seems to be still thinking and strategizing and brainstorming, and I believe that the recent conversations with the Uzbek delegation in Washington also included that conversation, like, what are we going to do together? What can we do together?
Right.
I guess the second part of my question would be, to what extent are you in sync with what Tashkent wants to do, what Tashkent wants you to do?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll say that the government of Uzbekistan has been extremely collaborative and communicative, has communicated a lot with us about its Afghanistan policy. I believe trying really hard to be part of an international consensus about what to do with respect to the Taliban government. So I think you correctly said that Uzbekistan is maybe one of the more forward-leaning countries in the world in terms of developing a relationship with the new government, not having formally recognized them still,
Yes.
but having, had lots of visits and signing agreements related to energy supply and actively pursuing projects like this, the idea of building a railroad line that would connect to Pakistan and so on. So they've been very forward-leaning, very proactive on that, but at the same time, very careful, I think, to be part of this international consensus that says the Taliban government needs to do certain things first before they will become legitimate in the eyes of the world and could get recognition, including, you mentioned the inclusive government. There's some debate about exactly what that means, how you define inclusive, but it's clear that the current government doesn't meet any of the definitions people are putting out there. There's also the issue of them not allowing terrorist groups to operate or expand on their territory. From an American point of view, this is fundamental. Obviously, our whole involvement in Afghanistan, really since 2001, has been about that issue at the most basic level. And then, of course, there's issues related to human rights, and especially the rights of women and girls. We just saw this past week a somewhat disturbing development, which was that the school for girls above the elementary grades was scheduled to reopen, and then on the same day it was closed again.
Right.
And there's no date for when it will be reopened. But the point is that on all of these issues, these kind of conditions that the international community has set, Uzbekistan has been firm in saying that they support those conditions and that they want to be part of the international consensus. So I think that's important. I also think that there are ways that we are and can in the future cooperate with Uzbekistan to the benefit of the region and to stability in the region. This has been true since before all the changes that happened last summer and the new government coming in, especially with regard to cooperation and counterterrorism. Going back to what I said earlier, we are very concerned that there not be a fertile ground on the soil of Afghanistan for the growth of terrorist groups. Terrorist groups operate there now. There's some evidence that they've been growing in number and ability to operate since the change of government last summer. I should say the overthrow of the government. Maybe change of government is a little too much of a euphemism. But the point is that that concern about the threat of terrorism is one we share very, very deeply with the Uzbeks and actually with the whole region of Central Asia. And so finding ways of cooperating to meet that threat, both to know what's happening in Afghanistan and to be able to combat it, is something we care very much about. And it's a common concern of the two countries.
As we watch how close is Tashkent with the interim government in Kabul now, it's very easy to think or expect that Uzbekistan is about to recognize the government there, right? The Taliban government. But we've had conversations, and the President Mirziyoyev, special assistant on Afghanistan, Ismatullah Ergashev, told us that no, we're not going to recognize Taliban individually. He did not say we're not going to. He says if we are to recognize the Taliban government, it will have to be a consensus, as you just said.
Yes.
It needs to be a regional consensus. It needs to be a consensus with our strategic partners, including the United States. And the question is, how possible is that? How far or how close is Washington to that?
On that question, I'm not going to be able to give you a very comprehensive answer, I'm afraid, because I'm not involved in the day-to-day workings of our Afghanistan policy. So I can't say how close or how far. I guess what I will say simply is that we do have some specific issues and conditions that we've been clear on with the Taliban government, and those have not been fulfilled yet.
There have been many conversations and discussions in Washington, in the think tanks. Those discussions include the members of the State Department, South and Central Asia Bureau, and others, including the White House, National Security Council, the Pentagon, and all the relevant agencies, discussing whether the Biden administration should update the Central Asia strategy, or is it time to update the Central Asia strategy now that America is fully out of Afghanistan, and what it will take now to convince the region that America still cares about Central Asia post-Afghanistan, because as we all know, Afghanistan was a priority in these relationships, and Afghanistan played a huge role in the political ties, in the political partnerships. So how do you explain to the Uzbek people, let's say, that America is still very much committed to all the priorities and promises that you've made over the years with this country?
Well, frankly, the best way to convince or to, I suppose, convince is the best word, the people of Uzbekistan that we mean those things is to show results, to do tangible things that show that. And I think if I can point to way more things than we have time for in this interview that we've done over just the 3 years I've been here that I think prove that. I'll just take a couple of very concrete examples. We are deeply committed to supporting the reforms that President Mirziyoyev started 5 years ago that will improve the country's ability to generate economic growth and provide for its citizens, including, for example, in the education sector, where we are working hand in hand with the Ministry of Public Education to improve the textbooks, the curriculum, especially with respect to IT and English language. And we have done a lot of very tangible things that have improved conditions in the classroom and the teaching skills of teachers to be able to raise students up. It's hard work, and it doesn't get a lot of attention. It's not glamorous work, but our partners in the ministry and in the government can see that we are committed to improving the lives and the welfare of citizens of Uzbekistan. So, in another field, another completely different area, in agriculture, we've been investing for many years, but especially in the last few years, in diversifying the crops that Uzbek farmers grow and helping them find markets, export markets. In the long run, this has benefited and is benefiting Uzbekistan citizens, putting money in their pocket, helping them create businesses and grow them. And this is something that we have done because we care about the future of this country. So again, I can make an unlimited number of statements, general statements about, we support Uzbekistan's sovereignty and independence, we want a prosperous Uzbekistan, but none of that will convince anyone, and I mean it, more than pointing to very concrete things that we have done and continue to do to benefit this country in a very tangible way.
I was here when the cotton campaign announced that it was ending the boycott, it was canceling the boycott on the Uzbek cotton, and it immediately raised questions and speculations that it could be related to the war in Ukraine, that America was sort of trying to demonstrate that it's going to support Uzbekistan as it expects economic challenges. I saw some Uzbek activists and bloggers and even journalists basically asking questions, hey, is the end of boycott related to what's happening in Ukraine? The
answer is no, by the way.
Yes, I was just going to add, So I know that the answer is no, because we know that this was coming. That the end of the boycott was being discussed. Yes, it was a long time coming. But how big of a deal is that? And what should the Uzbek government do? I know you don't want to be in the recommending role, but I am sure you must have conversations with the members of the Uzbek government about this. Uzbeks are seeing this as a victory, but at the same time as a historic challenge. Like, can you really now sustain this?
Yeah.
If you claim or if you conclude that we've ended forced labor and child labor, what would it take for the Uzbek government, for the Uzbek system, for the country in general, to maintain that and make sure that you continue to open and improve?
Yeah, so I'm glad you raised the lifting of the cotton campaign boycott, or the pledge as it was called, because we lose sight of that kind of event when there's so many other dramatic things happening in the world today and in the region. And it's a shame because it was a long time coming, and I truly would say that this is a historic development, a historic sign of progress. I think you and I have talked about this before over the years. The U.S. government and a lot of other partners, the International Labor Organization, the German government, the Swiss government, others, have supported now for the past almost 7 years, I think, this annual monitoring of the cotton harvest. And including, by the way, I think importantly, getting Uzbek civil society groups involved in the monitoring, who can now continue to do it, even when the international community maybe no longer has to play that role. And vitally important, we had very strong commitment from the government of Uzbekistan, from the president on down, to eradicate forced labor, child labor and forced labor in the cotton harvest. And after 5, 6, 7, however you want to count it, long years of work, the lifting of this boycott was the result, and it was a historic occasion. Now, that also provides a historic opportunity economically for Uzbekistan, as you mentioned, and there's much we can do to help with that in terms of matching U.S. companies with the market here, convincing them that it's time to come here to source cotton, apparel made from cotton from Uzbekistan. The opportunity is big now, not only because of reorientation that will happen due to the war in Ukraine, but also because, as you may know, there are sanctions against cotton from China, from the Xinjiang area of China, which has been a major source of cotton for the apparel industry for years now. And that means a lot of these companies are looking for a new place. They're looking for a new source. And Uzbekistan is there at the right time. So the timing is good from that perspective. There's a lot of goodwill and a lot of interest in helping. So I actually see this as a huge growth area for Uzbekistan's economy, and we can help.
The obvious question will be where Uzbekistan is in terms of starting its application process or attempt or efforts to join the WTO, and do you see the relevance there as well?
Yeah, I do, because joining WTO is all about having a more open trade regime and having all the laws in place and policies that will allow you to trade with the whole rest of the world and benefit from
And Uzbekistan needs to negotiate with each member of the organization, right?
Right. In addition to agreeing with the whole organization, they need to do these bilateral deals as well. So actually, yeah, I mean, there is a connection, with the ending of the boycott. I mean, the boycott didn't end because of Uzbekistan's WTO application, but again, there's a timing here. There's a convergence of positive things happening at the same time.
So the promise to support Uzbekistan in its bid to join the WTO came from the previous administration, from the Trump administration. So I know that Minister Umurzakov heard a similar commitment from the Biden administration as well. So can we assume that that commitment is as strong as it was when Wilbur Ross announced it in 2019? Absolutely,
and I was there during this recent visit when Deputy Prime Minister met with our U.S. Trade Representative, Ambassador Catherine Tai, and she uttered those same words.
Unchanged.
Unchanged. Strong, very strong commitment to Uzbekistan becoming a member, to facilitating that, and to helping it. Now, I should add that every country, including the United States, has to do these bilateral negotiations as part of the process. And in those negotiations, we'll be tough and stand up for U.S. interests too. It's got to be reciprocal.
So U.S. is not going to soften its requirements. Or
Yeah, we're gonna treat Uzbekistan the way we would any other country in the world in terms of, in other words, if you're going to get access to our market, we need access to your market too. It goes both ways. It's two-way trade. That said, I would say we're going above and beyond to help the process. And for example, USAID is providing technical assistance to the Ministry of Investment and Foreign Trade on the accession process. And we have one of our most experienced, I would say preeminent experts on the accession process, a former USTR official. He retired a few years ago, but he used to work there, who is in that role of advisor. And that's invaluable to get that kind of assistance and help. So yeah, the commitment is still there. It didn't change with the new administration.
What happened in Kazakhstan and what's happening, to Ukraine, with Ukraine, really makes everybody think about, reconsider the notion of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. I have to admit that even as a journalist, I have gotten a bit cynical about why the U.S. keeps on mentioning its support of independence and territorial. This is a mantra, right? Like Trinity, Holy Trinity, as previous Assistant Secretary Alice Wells, used to call it. What are the lessons for the United States from these two crises that have direct impact, obviously, on your relations with the region and on the region in general? What are the lessons for you as you continue to support these three things? What has changed for you?
Well, I think one thing that's changed is being able to understand that the unimaginable can become real. And
never say never.
Never say never, because everyone, and I would include people here in Uzbekistan who I spoke to in the government and outside the government, right up to the point where Putin sent his army into Ukraine, did not believe he would. They were absolutely convinced it wasn't possible, because how could he be that crazy? Like,
why would he do that?
Why would he do it? What's his plan? What's his strategy? How is he going to occupy this country? And yet it happened. So I do think that is a lesson to all of us, and it doesn't just apply to this region. I suppose it applies to the whole world, that you have to pay attention to what political leaders say their intentions are and take them seriously. Not to overdraw the historical comparisons, but we learned a little bit about that in the 1920s and 30s with Adolf Hitler, who wrote a book laying out his intentions and his objectives, and then he systematically carried those things out. But right up to the point that he invaded Poland in 1939, many world leaders did not believe he would actually do it, and they thought they had a way to persuade him not to. Including
the Soviet leadership.
Yes, right. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is Exhibit A. So anyway, that is something that we've been reminded of recently, and I think it should be a lesson for every country in the world. And I also think that you mentioned Kazakhstan too. There it's more complex. It's not as clear-cut a situation with respect to sovereignty and independence as the Ukraine one is, but there I think the lesson that everyone's drawing, I know that here in Uzbekistan too, is that you need to pay attention to what the public are saying and thinking, and some of the grievances that they have, because it can sometimes boil up into something that you did not expect and lead to interventions that you didn't expect. In this case, the deployment of the troops of the CSTO. Yes. Actually, the other effect it seems to have had, although I don't know that it took that crisis to make this happen necessarily, is I would say Uzbekistan has redoubled its efforts to build the bilateral relationship with Kazakhstan.
Yes.
And I've heard Uzbek officials repeatedly say that relationship is in some ways maybe the most important for Uzbekistan.
We hear that, yes.
And I think that's a great way of looking at it, because it's their neighbor. There's a lot of complementarity. There's a lot in common interests, and so developing trade, developing ties and jobs. I mean, we already have, we were talking about migrant workers earlier. I know that over the last few years, more migrant workers have been going to Kazakhstan rather than Russia.
True.
And again, I think that has some positive elements to it. So, you know, this is Central Asia as a region. And of course, you know, for years we've been working on this through our so-called C5+1 platform to build this sense of regional solidarity and common interests. But it's real. It exists, and the Uzbekistan-Kazakhstan example relationship is a good example.
And you support this, obviously.
Yes.
Well, we can talk forever and discuss all these issues that are so interconnected in this very comfortable room in sunny Tashkent, finally, you know.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for finding time for us, for having this wonderful discussion with us. We really appreciate it, and I'm sure our viewers are more appreciative of this than anyone. And it's always, they like to hear from you, as we know from social media. I mean, they love it when you speak in Uzbek, but...
No, good, and thank you for this. I always enjoy these conversations, and as I think I said maybe the last time we did an interview, I learn as much as from these conversations as I provide information. I learn just as much, so thank you.
Katta rahmat, elchi janoblari.
Marhamat.